The microfiber cloth was gray, worn, and damp with the sweat of my palms. It was the only thing standing between me and the wrath of Kim, a man who treated his cars better than the people who bled for him. I had spent 4 hours polishing the obsidian hood of his limited edition Chiron, making sure it reflected the cold, gray Seoul skyline. Then it happened. A single, accidental brush of my knuckles against the metal. A smudge. Kim didn't yell. He didn't have to. He just looked at that tiny mark, a mark made by the hands that cooked his meals and folded his laundry, and called it a contamination. He told me I had ruined the car's soul. Then he did the unthinkable. He didn't just fire me. He took my final paycheck to pay for a professional detailing and threw me out into the rain, telling his men to make sure I never worked in this city again. I sat on the curb for hours, my knees bruised from where his guards had dropped me, watching the rain wash away the last of my dignity. And then I looked at the date on my phone. May 7th. The anniversary of the day I ran away from my father's empire to prove I could survive on my own. Kim thought he was breaking a Maid. He didn't realize he was just ending my vacation. My name is Anna, and this is the story of how I returned to Kim's headquarters 24 hours later, not to beg for my job, but to buy the building he stands in and the car he loves before firing him from his own life. Stay with me, because the look on his face when I stepped out of a vehicle that cost more than his entire net worth? He never saw it coming. Hey, besties. Welcome to Clemency Love Stories. If this story is already hitting close to home, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments. Have you ever felt like you were living in someone else's shadow? Also, drop your time and location so we can say hi. Now let's get back to the most expensive revenge. The apartment was freezing. The radiator had hissed its last breath an hour ago, much like Anna's career. She stared at the black titanium card sitting on her scarred wooden table. It had been hidden in the lining of her suitcase for 3 years, a direct line to a life of private jets, boardrooms, and a father who measured love in acquisitions. She could call the number. She could end this struggle with a single hello. Or she could stay here, blacklisted and broken, just like Kim wanted. She picked up her phone. Her thumb hovered over the contact labeled home. Her hands shook, not from the cold, but from the memory of the afternoon. You've touched it with your filthy hands, Kim had sneered, his sharp features caught in the sunlight. Now the car and you are worthless to me. He had laughed while his men watched her scramble to pick up her few belongings from the gravel. It wasn't just the firing, it was the way he looked at her, as if she were a ghost, a nothing, a smudge on his perfect world. Anna looked back at the black card. She thought of Kim's legitimate business, the shipping empire that was secretly drowning in debt, waiting for a savior from the Han Global Group. She didn't call her father. She called his CFO. "This is Anna," she said, her voice dropping the maid persona and hardening into the steel of an heiress. "I'm coming home, and I want to authorize a hostile takeover. Start with Kim's holdings. I want him in the street by noon tomorrow." She hung up and walked to the window. Outside, the rain was still falling, but for the first time in years, Anna wasn't afraid of getting wet. She was the storm. The rain did not just fall, it felt like it was trying to wash me away. Every drop that hit my face felt like a tiny reminder of Kim's slap. My thin uniform was soaked through, sticking to my skin like a cold, wet cage. I walked down the narrow sidewalk of the city, my shoes making a squelching sound in the puddles. People rushed past me with their colorful umbrellas, not even looking at the girl who had just been tossed out like a piece of garbage. To them, I was just a tired maid. To Kim, I was even less than that. I stopped under the flickering neon sign of a closed grocery store to catch my breath. My knees were stinging from the gravel at the mansion, and my hands were shaking so hard I had to tuck them into my armpits to make them stop. For 3 years, I had tried so hard to be normal. I had lived in a tiny room, ate instant noodles for dinner, and worked until my back ached. I wanted to prove that I didn't need my family's name or their billions to have a life. I wanted to be Anna, the girl who worked hard, not Anna, the princess of a tech empire. But as I stood there in the dark, shivering and penniless, I realized that my humble life experiment was officially over. Being humble had not protected me. It had only made me a target for a man like Kim. He didn't see my hard work or my kindness. He only saw someone he could crush under his expensive Italian shoes. I leaned against the cold brick wall and looked down at my wet, cheap sneakers. I took a deep breath, the smell of damp pavement filling my lungs. Slowly, I reached down and untied my left shoe. I pulled out the inner sole and reached into a secret slit I had cut into the fabric years ago. My fingers felt something hard and cold. I pulled it out. It was a black titanium card. It was heavy, much heavier than a normal credit card, and it caught the light of the neon sign, glowing with a dull, dangerous shine. It was the only thing I had kept from the world I ran away from. It was a key to a kingdom I had tried to forget, but now it was the only weapon I had left. I stared at the card for a long time. Holding it felt like holding a live wire. As long as I had this card, I wasn't just a maid anymore. I was the heir to the Han Global Group. I was the woman who could buy and sell men like Kim without even checking the price tag. I felt a new kind of warmth spreading through my chest, chasing away the chill of the rain. It wasn't the warmth of a heater, it was the heat of a fire that was just starting to burn. The girl who had cried on the curb was gone. I stood up straight, ignoring the pain in my knees. I didn't need an umbrella anymore. I tucked the black card into my pocket and stepped back out into the downpour. My vacation in the real world was finished. It was time to go back to the top of the mountain, and this time, I wasn't going to let anyone look down on me ever again. Kim wanted to see what a worthless person looked like. I was going to show him. I was going to show him exactly who he had invited into his home, and I was going to make sure he remembered my name for the rest of his life. The walk to the edge of the city felt longer than usual, but the cold didn't bother me anymore. My mind was focused on the heavy gates of the Han estate. When I finally reached the tall stone walls, I didn't go to the service entrance like a maid would. I walked right up to the main iron gates. The security cameras swiveled toward me, clicking as they scanned my face. I held the black titanium card up to the glass reader. The light turned from red to a bright, welcoming green, and the heavy gates hissed open. The driveway was lined with trees that looked like they belonged in a palace. At the end of the path stood the mansion, a mountain of glass and marble that glowed under the moonlight. Standing by the massive front doors was a man I recognized instantly. It was Lee, my father's head of security. He was tall, wearing a perfectly pressed black suit and leather gloves. He hadn't changed at all in 3 years. As I stepped onto the porch, dripping wet and shivering, Lee didn't ask questions. He didn't look at my stained uniform or my messy hair with judgment. Instead, he snapped his heels together and performed a deep, respectful bow. It was the kind of bow only reserved for the family that owned everything he protected. "Welcome home, Miss Anna," he said, his voice as calm as a still lake. "Your father has been waiting for the day you would find your way back." I wiped the rain from my forehead and looked him straight in the eyes. I didn't want a hug or a warm meal. I didn't want to hear about my father's feelings. I wanted the power I had walked away from. I wanted the tools to dismantle Kim's pride piece by piece. "I'm not here to stay, Lee," I told him, my voice steady and cold. "But I need to settle a debt. And I need to do it with the right image." Lee nodded once, signaling the other guards to open the doors. I walked into the grand hallway, the marble floors cold beneath my wet sneakers. I looked at the luxury all around me, the gold leaf ceilings and the priceless paintings, and I didn't feel guilty anymore. I felt ready. "I have 2 demands," I said, turning back to Lee. "First, I want the white suit. The one from the Paris collection with the gold buttons. The one that says I am the boss of everyone in the room." Lee pulled out a small radio and whispered instructions to the staff. "Consider it done, Mississippi. It will be ready in your dressing room in 10 minutes. And the second thing," I continued, my heart beating faster. "I want the car. Not the one for the board meetings. I want the one they said could not be bought. The white prototype with the custom engine. I want the car that will make Kim's limited edition toy look like a piece of junk from a junkyard." For the first time, a small, tiny smile touched Lee's lips. He bowed again, lower than before. "The keys are already being pulled from the vault, Miss Anna. The chauffeur and the security team will be ready for you at dawn." Who shall we be visiting first? I looked at my reflection in a giant gold-framed mirror. I looked like a ghost in a maid's dress, but my eyes were full of fire. We're going to visit a man who thinks he owns the world, I whispered. It's time to show him who actually pays the bills. While I was stepping into my past, Kim was pacing back and forth in his office on the top floor of his headquarters. The room was filled with expensive leather and dark wood, but the air felt heavy with stress. Kim didn't look like the calm, scary man who had fired me and thrown me into the rain. His hair was messy, and his expensive black suit jacket was tossed over a chair. He looked like a man who was watching his world crumble. On his desk, 3 computer screens glowed with bright red numbers. Red meant loss. His shipping business, the one he used to pretend he was a normal businessman, was in deep trouble. He had spent too much money on luxury cars and private parties, and now the banks were closing in. He had less than 48 hours to find millions of dollars, or he would lose everything, his building, his cars, and his power over the city. He picked up a glass of water, but his hand was shaking so much that the ice cubes rattled. He looked out the window at the city lights. He was a leader in the underworld, a man people feared, but the banks didn't care about his reputation. They only cared about the debt. "Boss," a voice said from the doorway. It was one of his guards. The news from the Han Global Group just came in. Kim spun around, his eyes wide and hungry. What did they say? Will they meet with me? The guard nodded. They agreed to an emergency meeting for tomorrow morning. They said their CEO is personally interested in your company. They might be willing to buy your debt and save the business. Kim let out a long breath, falling back into his chair. A small, mean smile returned to his face. I knew it, he whispered to himself. They know I'm the best in the business. They wouldn't let a partner like me fail. He stood up and straightened his shirt, suddenly feeling powerful again. He didn't know that the Han Global Group was a massive empire that reached across the whole world. He only knew that they had more money than God, and he needed a tiny bit of it. He started thinking about how he would act during the meeting. He would be charming. He would show them his luxury cars and his big office to prove he was worth the investment. Make sure the lobby is perfect, Kim barked at his guard. I want the floors shining. I want every man in a clean suit. And get that car detailed again. The one that girl touched yesterday. I want it to look brand new for when the CEO arrives. Kim sat down and started practicing his handshake in the mirror. He felt like he had won. He thought a miracle was coming to save him. He had no idea that the secret CEO he was so excited to meet was the same girl he had called worthless just 24 hours ago. He was preparing a red carpet for his own destruction, and he was smiling while he did it. The sun had not yet risen when the transformation began. I stood in the center of my old dressing room, a place I hadn't stepped foot in for years. The air smelled of expensive perfume and fresh lilies. Around me, a team of professional stylists moved like silent shadows. They didn't see the girl who had been scrubbing floors yesterday. They only saw a masterpiece that needed to be finished. First came the hair. For years, I had kept it tied back in a messy, practical knot to keep it out of my face while I worked. Now, they washed it with oils that smelled of sandalwood and silk. They dried it into long, dark waves that bounced with every move I made. It felt heavy and thick, a crown of dark silk that framed my face. Next was the makeup. They used soft brushes to highlight my cheekbones and sharpen my jawline. My skin looked flawless, like pale marble. They painted my lips a soft, neutral color that looked natural but commanded respect. When they finished, I looked in the mirror and barely recognized the person looking back. The tired, soft eyes of a maid were gone. In their place were the cold, sharp eyes of a woman who was ready for war. Then came the jewelry. Lee walked into the room carrying a velvet-lined box. Inside lay a diamond necklace that was so bright it seemed to hold its own light. It was heavy, a cold weight around my neck that felt like a shield. I put on the diamond chandelier earrings, feeling them brush against my neck. Each piece was worth more than Kim's entire car collection. But to me, they weren't just decorations. They were my armor. Every diamond was a reminder that I was untouchable. Finally, it was time for the suit. Two women held up the ultra-tailored white double-breasted pantsuit. The fabric was crisp and expensive, with gold buttons that shone like tiny suns. I stepped into the pants and pulled on the jacket. It fit me perfectly, tightening at my waist and widening at my shoulders to give me a powerful, royal shape. The white color was so bright it felt aggressive. In a world of men in black suits, I would be the light that blinded them. I picked up the large black designer sunglasses and slid them onto my face. They hid my eyes, making it impossible for anyone to read my thoughts or see my emotions. I felt a wall go up between me and the rest of the world. I picked up the white luxury handbag and stepped into my high heels. Each step I took made a sharp, rhythmic sound against the floor. Click, click, click. It was the sound of someone who knew exactly where they were going. I walked down the grand staircase, where Lee and a line of bodyguards were waiting. They all bowed in unison, their faces serious. I didn't feel like the girl who had run away anymore. I felt like the person I was always meant to be. I wasn't just dressing up to look pretty. I was putting on the uniform of a conqueror. I looked at Lee and gave a single, sharp nod. The transformation was complete. The maid was dead, and the billionaire queen had taken her place. It was time to go collect what was mine. The car ride was silent, but it was a heavy, powerful silence. I sat in the back of the white luxury vehicle, the leather seats smelling of wealth and new beginnings. Across from me sat the man Lee had chosen to be my personal shadow. He was muscular and sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the window. He wore a sharp black suit and thin black leather gloves that never seemed to come off. He didn't speak unless he had to, which made his presence feel even more dangerous. "What is your name?" I asked, my voice echoing slightly in the quiet cabin. "You can call me Min, Miss Anna," he replied. His voice was deep and steady, like the hum of the car's engine. He turned his head slightly toward me. "I work security for one of Kim's shipping docks before your father's company recruited me. I know the man you are going to see." I looked at his gloved hands. "Is he as successful as he pretends to be?" Min shook his head. "He is a bully, Mississippi. He doesn't just fire people. He enjoys breaking them. I saw him force a warehouse worker to kneel in the mud for 10 hours because he dropped a crate. I saw him blacklist a young driver so he couldn't feed his family, all because the man didn't bow low enough." Hearing this made my blood run cold. I thought about the way Kim had looked at me when I touched his car. I thought about the slap and the humiliation. I had spent the last few hours thinking this was only about my own pride, but Min's words changed everything. My heart hammered against my ribs, but it wasn't from fear. It was from a new, burning sense of justice. "He does it to everyone, doesn't he?" I whispered. "Anyone he thinks is smaller than him." "Every single one," Min said. "He treats his staff like tools that can be thrown away when they get a scratch. He thinks his money makes him a god, and he thinks the people who work for him are less than human. There are hundreds of people in this city who have lost their homes and their hope because of his temper." I leaned back against the headrest and closed my eyes. The diamonds around my neck felt heavier now, but in a good way. They weren't just a sign that I was rich. They were a sign that I was the only person who could stop him. If I had stayed a maid, I would have just been another victim on his long list. But by coming back as the CEO of Han Global, I had the power to be a shield for every person Kim had ever stepped on. "Thank you for telling me, Min," I said, opening my eyes. My gaze was fixed on the road ahead. He thinks he's meeting an investor today. He thinks he's going to get a check that saves his life. "And what is he actually getting, miss?" Min asked. "He's getting exactly what he gave to us," I said, my voice as sharp as a diamond. "He's getting a reminder that no one is invisible. I'm not just going there to take his business. I'm going there to take his throne." Min gave a small, respectful nod and went back to watching the road. The city buildings began to grow taller as we approached Kim's headquarters. I gripped my white handbag tightly. My revenge had grown into something much bigger than a smudge on a car. This was for the warehouse workers, the drivers, and every maid who had ever been told they were worthless. The woman in white was coming, and she was bringing justice with her. The street in front of Kim's headquarters looked like a scene from a movie. Two long lines of men in black suits stood perfectly still on the sidewalk, creating a path from the curb to the front doors. Kim stood at the very top of the stairs, looking down at the empty road. He had spent the morning shouting at everyone to make sure everything was perfect. He had even put on his most expensive watch, hoping to look like a man who is still powerful and successful. He kept checking his reflection in the glass doors, practicing a smile that looked friendly but strong. To him, this wasn't just a meeting. It was his last chance to stay alive in the business world. Then, the sound arrived. It wasn't the normal rumble of a car. It was a deep, powerful roar that made the windows of the building rattle. A white hypercar turned the corner, its sleek body reflecting the sunlight like a polished pearl. It moved slowly and smoothly, looking more like a spaceship than a vehicle. As it pulled up to the curb, even Kim's toughest guards couldn't help but stare. They had seen many luxury cars, but they had never seen anything like this. It was the car that money couldn't buy, the one that only belonged to the highest elite. Kim's eyes lit up with greed and excitement. He thought the person inside was his savior. He smoothed out his suit jacket and took a deep breath, stepping forward with his hand already reaching out for a handshake. He assumed he was about to meet an old man or a boring businessman in a gray suit. He had a charming speech ready about how shipping company was the best investment in the city. He wanted to show the investor that he was a man of taste and high status. The car came to a complete stop right in front of him. The engine cut off, leaving a ringing silence in the air. For a moment, nothing happened. Everyone held their breath, looking at the dark tinted glass of the windows. Kim leaned in slightly, trying to see who was behind the wheel, but the windows were like black mirrors. He could only see his own sweaty, nervous face looking back at him. He didn't realize that the person inside was looking right through him. Min, the bodyguard with the black leather gloves, stepped out from the driver's side. He didn't look at Kim. He didn't bow. He moved with a cold, military precision that made Kim's own guards look like amateurs. Min walked around to the back door and placed his hand on the handle. Kim stood tall, puffing out his chest and putting on his biggest fake smile. He was ready to greet the billionaire who would save his empire. He was ready to act like the boss. He had no idea that the door was about to open on his worst nightmare. He was standing on the edge of a cliff, and he was smiling because he thought he was about to fly. Min pulled the car door open with a slow, steady motion. For a second, all that could be seen was the flash of a white high heel hitting the pavement. Then I stepped out. The white suit glowed under the morning sun, almost too bright to look at. I adjusted my black sunglasses and stood tall, my diamonds sparkling like fire against my neck. I didn't look at the guards or the building. I looked straight at Kim. The change in his face was like watching a building collapse. His fake, charming smile didn't just fade. It twisted into a look of pure confusion and then horror. He was holding an expensive ceramic coffee cup, but his fingers went limp. The cup slipped from his hand and hit the concrete with a loud crack, splashing brown liquid all over his polished shoes and the red carpet he had laid out. He didn't even blink. He just stared at me, his mouth hanging open as he tried to find his voice. "You," he finally gasped. The word sounded like a choke. He took a shaky step back, pointing a trembling finger at my face. "What is this? What are you doing in that car? Why are you wearing those clothes?" I didn't answer. I just walked forward, my heels clicking rhythmically on the ground. Each step I took made him flinch. The woman in white was a ghost from his past that had come back to life, and he couldn't understand how the girl he had humiliated yesterday was standing before him looking like a queen. "Get out!" Kim suddenly screamed, his face turning a deep, angry red. "How dare you show your face here? Guards! Take her away. Throw her into the street where she belongs." He looked around wildly, expecting his men to move, to grab me, to push me back into the dirt. But nobody moved. His guards, the men who had watched him slap me just 24 hours ago, stood like stone statues. They didn't look at Kim. They looked at Min, who was standing behind me with his arms crossed, and then they looked at the Han Global logo on the side of the car. They weren't stupid. They knew who really held the power now. "Did you hear me?" Kim shrieked, his voice cracking with panic. He grabbed the shoulder of the nearest guard and tried to shake him. I said, "Get her out of here. I am the boss. I pay your salaries." The guard slowly removed Kim's hand from his shoulder and stepped aside, bowing his head as I walked past. The silence was deafening. Kim's power was vanishing right in front of his eyes. He was no longer the scary mafia boss. He was just a small, loud man standing in a puddle of spilled coffee. I stopped just inches away from him and tilted my head. I could see the sweat beads forming on his forehead. "You're wrong, Kim," I said, my voice low and as cold as ice. "You don't pay their salaries anymore. You can't even pay your own rent." I pulled my sunglasses down just enough, so he could see the fire in my eyes. He started to tremble, his knees shaking so hard he had to lean against the wall. He finally realized that the savior he had been waiting for hadn't come to help him. She had come to take everything he had left. Without saying another word, I walked right through the front doors of his headquarters, leaving him gasping for air in the shadows of the men who no longer feared him. The boardroom was at the very top of the building, and it was filled with Kim's board of directors. These were the men who helped him run his empire, and they all sat around a long, polished table. When I walked in, followed by Min, the room went completely silent. They were expecting the CEO of Han Global, but they were looking at a young woman in a white suit who looked like she owned the sun. Kim came running in a moment later, his face sweaty and his eyes darting around like a trapped animal. He tried to shove past Min to get to the head of the table, but Min didn't even move. He stood like a wall of iron. Kim had to take a seat at the very end of the table, far away from the seat of power. He looked small and defeated, but there was still a spark of anger in his eyes. I didn't wait for anyone to speak. I walked to the head of the table and pulled a thick blue folder from my handbag. I didn't hand it to him. I tossed it onto the table, and the sound of it hitting the wood was like a gunshot in the quiet room. The folder slid across the polished surface and stopped right in front of Kim. "You've been waiting for a savior, Kim," I said, my voice calm and steady. "You spent all morning practicing your smile and checking your reflection, hoping the Han Global Group would give you a check to fix your mistakes." Kim grabbed the folder, his hands shaking as he flipped through the pages. His eyes moved fast, scanning the legal words and the bright red stamps. "What is this?" he stammered. "This isn't an investment contract. These are debt notices. This says my bank accounts are frozen." I leaned forward, resting my hands on the table. I wanted him to see the diamonds on my fingers. I wanted him to see the person he had treated like dirt. "You wanted an investment, Kim? You thought I was going to give you money so you could keep bullying people and buying more cars? You were wrong. I didn't buy your company's future. I bought your past." The room was so quiet you could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall. The other directors looked down at their laps, too afraid to look at Kim or me. "I bought every single cent of your debt," I continued. "As of 5 minutes ago, I own the deed to this building. I own the titles to every luxury car in your garage, including the one you made me polish with my own clothes. I even own the very suit you are wearing right now because it was bought with money you owed to the people you stepped on." Kim's face went from red to a ghostly white. He looked down at his sleeves as if the fabric were suddenly burning his skin. He tried to stand up, to shout, to reclaim his dignity, but he had nothing left to stand on. Everything around him, the chair he sat in, the air he breathed in this office, now belonged to me. "You told me I was worthless because I touched your car," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that filled the room. "But now you're the one with nothing. You aren't a boss. You aren't a leader. You're just a man in a borrowed suit standing in my office. And I think it's time for you to leave." I stood up and turned my back on him, looking out the window at the city. I could hear the sound of the folder falling to the floor. Kim tried to speak, but no words came out. He was finally seeing the truth. The maid hadn't just come back, she had replaced him. He had spent his whole life climbing a mountain of cruelty, only to find out that I owned the mountain. Kim fell back into his chair, but the expensive leather didn't feel like a throne anymore. It felt like a cage. He looked around the room at his board of directors, hoping to see a single person who would stand up for him. But they all looked away. They were already opening their own folders, looking at the new contracts that had the Han Global logo on them. Kim was invisible in his own boardroom. His breath came in short, jagged gasps, and he clutched the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. All the power he had spent years building through fear and cruelty had vanished in a single morning. I didn't stay to watch him cry. I didn't need to hear his excuses or his pleas for mercy. I had said everything I needed to say. I turned away from the window and walked toward the door. Min stepped aside, opening it for me with a silent, respectful nod. As I walked past Kim, I didn't even look down at him. He wasn't a monster to me anymore. He wasn't a boss. He was just a small, broken man who had forgotten that the people he stepped on were human beings. I walked past him without a second glance, my heels clicking firmly on the floor. As I reached the lobby, the air felt different. The tension was gone, replaced by a strange, quiet wonder. The guards and the office staff were all standing still, watching me. They had heard the news through the grapevine. They knew the world had changed. Near the front desk, I saw a young girl. She was wearing the same thin, scratchy maid's uniform I had worn just 2 days ago. She was holding a tray with a fresh cup of coffee, her hands trembling so much the ceramic rattled. Her eyes were wide with shock and fear, probably wondering if she was next to be fired. I stopped in front of her. The girl looked down at her shoes, her shoulders hunched, as if she were waiting for a blow. I reached into my white handbag and pulled out a thick stack of bills, the cash Kim had tried to withhold from my last paycheck, plus much more. I placed the money on her tray, right next to the coffee. "Keep the change," I said, my voice soft but clear enough for everyone in the lobby to hear. The girl looked up at me, her mouth falling open. "And take the rest of the day off. Actually, take the week off with full pay. You've worked hard enough." The girl blinked, tears starting to pool in her eyes. But Mr. Kim Hill. "Mr. Kim doesn't make the rules here anymore," I told her with a small, tired smile. I looked around the room at all the faces, the tired drivers, the worried clerks, and the silent guards. I stood tall, letting the white suit and the diamonds catch the light one last time. I am the new boss now. And in this company, we don't break people. We build them up. I didn't wait for her to thank me. I walked out the front doors and into the bright afternoon sun. The white hypercar was waiting for me, its door held open by Min. As I sat in the back seat and the car pulled away, I looked at my reflection in the window. The story of the woman in white spread through the city faster than a wildfire. In the coffee shops where maids gathered, and in the dark warehouses where drivers rested, people whispered about the day the world turned upside down. They talked about the girl who was fired for a fingerprint and returned as a queen. For the people who had felt invisible for so long, I wasn't just a CEO, I was a legend. I was proof that the person scrubbing the floor today could be the person owning the building tomorrow. Kim did not go out with a bang. He faded away into the shadows, exactly like the people he used to bully. Without his cars, his office, or his fear, he was nothing. I heard he was spotted months later walking in the rain, wearing an old, wrinkled suit that no longer fit his shaking frame. He had lost the power to hurt anyone, and in the end, that was the greatest punishment of all. He had to live in a world where he was just a regular man, and for someone like him, being ordinary was a nightmare. I moved into a new office at the top of the Han Global building, but I kept a small, gray microfiber cloth on my desk. I kept it there to remind me of where I came from. I didn't want to forget the cold rain or the sting of the gravel on my knees. That pain was my strength. It made me a different kind of leader. I spent my days changing the rules of the company, making sure every worker had health care, fair pay, and most importantly, respect. Sometimes, in the quiet moments of the evening, I would look at my reflection in the window. I still wore the diamonds and the tailored white suits, but I didn't feel like I was wearing armor anymore. The two halves of my life had finally come together. I had the humble heart of a servant who knew the value of hard work, and I had the power of a queen who could change the world with a single signature. I was no longer running away from my name, and I was no longer hiding in the shadows of a mansion. I stood in the light, ready to build a kingdom where no one was ever considered worthless. As the sun set over the city, I realized that my journey hadn't been about revenge after all. It had been about finding out who I truly was. I was Anna, the woman who turned a moment of shame into a lifetime of justice. My story as a maid was over, but my story as a leader was only just beginning. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt small or worthless or forgotten, I want you to know something. You're not alone, and you're stronger than you think. If you enjoyed this journey with me, please hit that like button. It helps more people find these stories. People who need to hear them, drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever had a moment where you'd stood up for yourself? Where you finally said enough? I read every single comment, and I love hearing your stories. And if you want more stories about survival, strength, and second chances, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. I share new stories every week.